The former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was sentenced tonight to over 27 years in prison after a Supreme Court judgment earlier today. Bolsonaro, who was president from 2019 to 2022, was found guilty of attempting to use military force to overturn an election and plotting to assassinate a political rival, the man who holds the presidency now, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. His trial had already led to a confrontation between Brazil's current government and the Trump administration, which could now expand. Here's our Nick Schifrin.
In Brazil's Supreme Court today, a historic conviction. Jair Bolsonaro, the former army captain who became Brazil's first modern right-wing president, guilty of trying to, quote, abolish democracy, and guilty of a coup and assassination attempt on current President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who won the 22 election over Bolsonaro by less than 1%. The guilty verdicts detail an extensive attempt to overturn the will of the people. The culmination, Bolsonaro incited supporters to storm the seat of government and vandalize the presidential palace just days after Lula, as he's universally known, took office.
De que grupo liderado por Jair Messias Bolsonaro.
A group led by Jair Messias Bolsonaro, composed of key figures from the government, the armed forces, and intelligence agencies, developed and implemented a progressive and systematic plan to attack democratic institutions with the aim of undermining the legitimate transfer of power in the 2022 elections.
Bolsonaro's critics call today a victory for Brazil's rule of law, a reaffirmation of the 1980s Constitution created to end 2 decades of dictatorship. But Bolsonaro's supporters, and there are many, call his prosecution political, and they vow to keep up their protests, including Bolsonaro's likely conservative successor, Sao Paulo's governor.
We cannot destroy democracy under the pretext of rescuing it. We also cannot tolerate a conviction without proof. A conviction without proof opens a wound that will never heal.
Bolsonaro's supporters have found a kindred spirit in President Trump, who sanctioned the justice overseeing Bolsonaro's case using laws usually reserved for human rights abuses. President Trump also raised tariffs on Brazil to 50% and today praised Bolsonaro.
I think it's a terrible thing. Very terrible. I think it's very bad for Brazil.
But President Trump's intervention failed to prevent today's verdict or convince Lula to drop his defiance.
Não somos e não seremos novamente colônia de ninguém.
We are not, and we will never again be, anyone's colony. We are capable of governing and caring for our land and our people without interference from any foreign government.
Tonight, Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned the U.S. will, quote, respond accordingly to this witch hunt. For a deeper look, we turn to Brian Winter, the Executive Vice President of the Americas Society and Councils of the Americas, nonprofit groups that seek to foster greater understanding throughout the Western Hemisphere. Brian Winter, thanks very much. Welcome to the NewsHour. Brazil's a young democracy, no stranger to coups and dictatorships. How significant is it that Bolsonaro has become the first former president to be convicted of plotting to overthrow an election?
It's a big day. It's a historic day for Brazil for the reasons that you cite. It's a country that just recovered its democracy a little more than 40 years ago, therefore is especially sensitive to any kind of risk of losing it. This is also a big day for the relationship between Brazil and the United States, because as your program just noted, we do expect there to be some sort of response from the Trump White House, which has described this whole process, this whole trial against former President Bolsonaro, his ally, as a witch hunt.
Before I get to the U.S. and President Trump, 27 years is the sentence that just came down in the last few minutes. Very significant. But does that mean that Jair Bolsonaro will spend the next 27 years in prison?
I think there's good reason to doubt that. You know, there's a somewhat overused expression about Brazil, which is that it's not for beginners. And this is a country where, you know, what seems like finality rarely is. And as proof of that, of course, the current president, President Lula, was also sentenced to jail back in 2018 on corruption charges. He ended up serving about 2 years, was then released, and is now president of Brazil. So if you get into the business of making too many predictions, you're likely to make a mistake. And look, it's clear that between 30, 35%, 40% of the country, pretty hardcore Bolsonaro supporters who are likely to vote for whoever the candidate will be in next year's election, whether that's a member of the Bolsonaro family or perhaps another candidate, such as the current governor of Sao Paulo.
So as you just indicated, Brazil is deeply polarized. How will Bolsonaro's conviction and the sentence resonate through society?
That's a good question. I think we're going to see that now. I mean, you know, I'm an American. I lived in Brazil for many years. I follow the country closely. The parallels between our countries over the last 10 years or so have sometimes been bizarre. And just as there was a period where it seemed like President Trump was on the outs after he left office in 2021 and he wasn't polling well, you know, Bolsonaro has gone through, I think, a phase where his supporters have been feeling somewhat dejected. And we'll see now if, with this trial and perhaps images eventually of President Bolsonaro being led away to prison after his appeals are rejected, if he fails to get house arrest, which I know his lawyers are pushing for, that may reanimate the Bolsonaro base in the same way that some of the trials against President Trump reanimated Republican supporters who appeared ready at one point to sort of, you know, look toward other candidates.
But there is clearly a version of Bolsonaro's movement that will follow Bolsonaro after, whether he's in prison or in house arrest?
Well, it's a country that has become more conservative over the last 10, 20 years. Nobody contests that. It's a country where, for example, evangelical Christians have gone from being about 8% of the population in a largely Roman Catholic country in the 1980s to about 27% of the population today. That is part of the reason why Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. And, you know, it's a 50-50 country in some ways. The last election was literally 51-49 and Lula won. But it's a country where, you know, a lot of the same issues of gun rights and so-called gender ideology and abortion and other topics are really animating people. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why President Trump and his allies have latched onto this case and have felt such a, you know, a kinship with President Bolsonaro, is because they do see these similarities. There's people like Steve Bannon who go back and forth between both movements, Jason Miller, who another member of President Trump's orbit. And so, again, you know, I don't always like to say that what happens in Brazil is because of what's happening in the U.S., but there have been a lot of parallels over the last 10 years or so.
So quickly, in the last 45 seconds or so we have left, let's come back to U.S. policy. As you called it, a kinship between President Trump and Bolsonaro. Tonight, President Trump, as we saw, criticized the conviction. Secretary of State Rubio vowing that the U.S. would respond. The U.S. already has imposed sanctions on the judge overseeing this case. If we were to see more sanctions like that, what would be the response?
Well, Brazil is not the only country in the world that has faced U.S. sanctions, but it is the only country in the world where those sanctions have been linked to a judicial process. So far, this 50% tariff has not changed the mind of the courts. In fact, it may have even solidified their willpower. But we'll see. I mean, people in Brazil are worried about what President Trump might do next, and that'll be the next chapter in this story.
Brian Winter, thank you very much.
Thank you.